Okay, we are up and running. We're going to start here in just about a minute. And we'll get things kicked off for all of you. Thank you for joining us, and we'll be here. We'll get started in about 60 seconds. Great. Thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is John Fanning. I'm the treasurer of the Greater Houston Business Ethics Roundtable. I'm also a vice president with Integrity Risk, and Integrity Risk is sponsoring today's meeting for the Greater Houston Business Ethics Roundtable virtual meeting. I am happy to be here, and I will be hosting this. I'm going to hand this off to our president, Vanessa Rossi, who will take us a little further, do some introductions, and hand it off to Joya. Thanks everyone for being here, and we'll kick off this meeting. Hi, Vanessa.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining GHBER's September webinar. I'd like to thank all of our GHBER members for joining and extend a special welcome to our Austin and San Antonio colleagues who are joining us this morning, and also any HR colleagues who have joined their GHBER member on this webinar. Thank you to Michelle Hay and Heather Lawley of Sedgwick for talking to us about this important topic. And thanks again, John, at Integrity Risk International. They are again hosting the webinar for us and providing the platform. Before I kick it off to today's topic, I first would like to introduce Michelle Hay and tell you a little bit about her. Michelle has over 25 years of professional experience with the unique combination of human resources leadership and consulting expertise. She most recently served as the Global Chief Human Resources Officer for Cushman & Wakefield, and previously held HR leadership roles at several other large corporations and consultancies, including Deloitte and EY and PwC, where she drove the development and implementation of new and innovative HR programs. Michelle joined Sedgwick in January 2021. She handles executive responsibilities that include overseeing the company's global HR team, managing its benefit offerings, identifying and developing talent, furthering diversity and inclusion efforts, strategizing corporate social responsibility, as well as fostering a collaborative work culture and positive colleague experience. Before Sedgwick, she was the Chief Human Resources Officer for Cushman & Wakefield, and also the HR leader at A.T. Kearney. Michelle has been featured in Forbes magazine and on the Chicago Business Journal's Crane's Daily Gist podcast, offering insight and thought leadership on the state of the workplace during the COVID-19 pandemic and other timely HR issues. Michelle holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Houston and an MBA from the University of Illinois. As you can see, we have an expert on this topic today. Thank you for speaking with us this morning, Michelle. Now I will turn it over to Joya Williams, GHBER's program chairman, to tell you a little bit more about today's webinar.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Vanessa. Today's webinar is called Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Today. We are very pleased to have Michelle Hay joining us from Chicago, and also with Michelle is her colleague, Heather Lawley, who is the global head of DEI at Sedgwick. Today, they're going to address how leading companies are integrating diversity, equity, and inclusion into their business. It will include the evolution of how companies have addressed DEI, how events are shaping what is happening now, as well as very practical things that can be done to drive diversity, equity, and inclusion in your organizations. During the call today, attendees are muted, but you will have the option to type a question in the chat log or in the Q&A, and we will address those questions at the end of the webinar. At this time, I will now turn it over to Michelle Hay and Heather Lawley. Thank you for joining.
Thank you for the warm welcome, Vanessa and Joya. Heather and I are so excited to be with this Texas crowd today. Heather is going to kick us off and talk about the current state of DE&I and the impacts that the pandemic has had. And then I will bring us home with how to drive inclusion in a post-pandemic world. And here's a hint for you. People managers have never been more important. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Heather to give us the current state. Heather, take it away.
Thank you, Michelle. Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. So really, as I think about the work that I have done in this field, it's been really interesting to see the progression from a place of, say originally just compliance to potentially a place where it was perceived as a warm and fuzzy, that people really didn't know what was going on with it, to a place where it's really a critical business imperative that is really attracting and maintaining team members, engaging and keeping clients, and really making positive impacts on communities. So Michelle, if we go forward. So the good news is that there's good news. We've had progress coming so far, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. If I think about my experience over the last, almost 30 years, and how the work environment and the demographics have changed, it's changed a lot. And I can definitely say that leadership teams are more diverse today than they were. Also, inclusion is a topic that is not only on the agenda, but is being measured by companies regularly. And we now have added equity to the conversation, which is great, because that's the place where a lot of this takes shape and there's a lot of action around it. And anybody who's done this work knows that DEI is not a one and done. It definitely is a lifetime journey, and the work can be hard. So if we talk a little bit about the landscape, let's first understand what some of the benefits are. If we look at diversity, McKinsey recently did a study showing that companies with more gender diverse leadership were 25% more likely to have above average profitability. And the more women that you have in leadership, the higher the likelihood of outperformance. Now, one thing to note on the next slide is that while we've been making progress, it's still been slow. McKinsey has been looking at demographics over many, many years. And if we look at the most recent time frame that they had captured, there was growth, but it was slow growth. And 1/3 of companies still have no women at all on executive teams. And when we think about the opportunity for profitability, there's definitely a missed opportunity. And if we also think then in terms of ethnically diverse organizations, that is critically important. You can see that 36%, they're 36% more likely to outperform their peers. And then we think about what employees are seeking. 3 out of 4, according to Glassdoor, are looking for opportunities at companies that value diversity. So it's clear, diverse teams drive better financial performance, and employees want to work for diverse companies. And just to reiterate that, it's so important that according to Deloitte, 39% of people actually reported that they would leave their current organization for a more diverse and inclusive one. There have been about 250 studies that have been done on the positive impacts of DE&I and how it's good for business. But from what you've seen from some of the McKinsey metrics and perhaps what you've seen in your own organization, progress can be slow. And I think, a lot of that can have to do with driving the strategy and tangibly executing actions that have measurable results. So if we talk a little bit about the strategy, I think a couple of the key things that I've learned from my experience are that DEI has to be important to the CEO. It needs to be an enabler of the business strategy. The CEO needs to model the behavior. They need to hold the leader accountable. In addition, it really can't be a standalone function. it has to be, again, included and embedded in the business and embedded into talent processes. This is one place where I would say that I've seen perhaps companies fall down a little bit when they take a little bit more of a purely programmatic approach. It tends to have isolated impacts, doesn't have a continuum, and a lot of times is really perceived as extra work to do rather than just the way things are done. So if we want to get those benefits of increasing the profitability, we have to get and keep diverse talent. And in order to be able to do that, we need to create an environment where people want to be and stay. And really what I would recommend is that DEI needs to be a systemic approach. It just really needs to be the way that things are done and be part of the company's DNA rather than something that is separate. I call it baked in versus bolted on. I really believe that baked in approach really helps to accelerate the impact. So if we talk about diversity, this is really the first leg of the stool. And let's get into some of the specifics about how and where we can drive impact around diversity. I'll give one example that tends to be fairly typical for companies. Is that there's a lack of gender diversity in leadership. It could also be said that there's a lack of people of color in leadership. So what the examples that I'm giving here, while they might be particular to women, a lot of these examples and tactics could be used across multiple diversity demographics. So one thing that we did at a company where I was previously, we did a couple of things in tandem. We found by doing them together, we really had an amplified effect. First was a diverse candidate slate. Having multiple candidates that were diverse on a slate was required. And in order to be able to do that, we first needed to understand where we had gaps. So we really looked at the diversity data to understand where we had those opportunities and where we wanted to focus. We then also worked with the talent acquisition team to identify new talent resources to be able to bring in a broader funnel of diverse qualified candidates. The next thing is diverse interviewer panels. And this is really important. It's really important for people to be able to see themselves or envision themselves at a company when they're interviewing. This also had at least 2 diverse people on the panel, and it required that we did some training with our recruiters so that they understood the strategic nature of why we were doing what we were doing, and also gave them the tools and skills to be able to be strategic advisors to the hiring managers, so that as they were looking at their teams, they really were looking at the diversity makeup. That could also include diversity of thought, skills, and styles, as well as the more traditional diversity dimensions, so that they can really maximize the benefits. The next thing that we did was managing bias training for people leaders. This was really important, not just for hiring, but across all decisions that they're making about people, and making sure that bias is not coming into the conversation or the decision making. What was also important here is that we didn't just do a training. We did a training and then did playbooks and follow-ups and made it really applicable to real life so that people could apply these principles as they were making decisions about their people. This sort of effort where we combine multiple things together in these particular things did drive results for us. We got 3x increase in female hires, which was really, really big for us. We were having challenges in particular parts of our organization, like sales and engineering. I used to work at a tech company, and having that sort of multiplier effect was actually huge for us. So other ways we can drive diversity are to value skills over degrees. So it's fairly typical that a lot of corporations require a 4-year college degree to be able to become an employee. But what we would recommend is that you take a look and really evaluate each of your jobs and roles to understand which really require the skills versus degrees, and those that require degrees. This sort of exercise really increases the ability to have a broader socioeconomic and set of diverse candidates as you look into to bringing people into your company. So then if we switch gears a little bit and focus on the second leg of the stool, which is equity. So let's talk a little bit about the difference between equity and equality first, just to set the landscape. Equality is that everybody gets the same thing. And then equity is that everyone gets what they need. And this is really what creates a level playing field. This is what enables people to get equitable access to resources and opportunities. So let's, again, get real tangible in some specific examples. What I'm going to talk about here is gender balance. You know, when you've got gender balance at the entry levels, but when we're looking to move women up to the higher levels of the organization, they're not being advanced or promoted. There are a variety of different things that could play into that. I'll call them, you know, root cause things, but there are a lot of different levers that can be pulled, and I'll give some examples here. So during calibration conversations, promotion conversations, appoint someone to be a DEI, what I call interrupter. You know, someone who is there to make sure that the conversations are done without bias, and that opportunities are being offered or provided in equitable sorts of ways. And I'll give you an example. I was in a calibration session where there was a woman who was being evaluated to be promoted into a leadership role. And there was a leader in the room who commented that she had just had a baby, so she probably wouldn't be interested in the promotion. He was presuming that he thought he knew what she wanted. And that was actually raised in the room, to be able to have a dialogue around what she actually wants and making sure that we're treating people equitably. Now, as these DEI interrupters, you can have your HR business partners. Obviously, you would need to train them with the right skills to be able to do that. Or you can rotate that role around to different people so that you get a broader level of understanding and ownership across different organizations. Another way to do this, to create more diversity in your leadership levels, is to create development opportunities for underrepresented groups. And there are a couple different ways that you can do this. One is when you're succession planning, making sure that you identify diverse potential successors. Now, some of the pushback that you may get, and it may be true, is that there may not be currently any diverse successors. And so that's where it's incumbent upon us as leaders to make sure that we're digging deep and really identifying up and coming talent and making sure that they have the right development plans to get them the skills that they have. And as Michelle mentioned, this is another area where the manager's role is really, really critical in helping to ensure and drive development for their team members. Next is to create specific leadership development programs for particular demographics. These can be acquired from different universities or from vendors off the shelf, or you can even develop them yourself. I think an important element here is that when you're designing the curriculum, that you're making sure to consider some of the areas where particular demographic groups may have challenges or gaps in their skills. And an example is that it's been shown from studies that women typically, as they're going into leadership, may lack business acumen and executive presence. That would be something, as an example, that you'd want to make sure is part of the agenda to make sure that you're helping them to increase that skill set. Next is making sure that diverse talent is getting exposure. This is really a big one. A lot of underrepresented groups don't get the same opportunities to network, to have mentors, to just even get exposure to be on the roadmap as known talent. And a couple good ways are that employee resource groups often give people the opportunities to stretch beyond their day-to-day jobs. And that's a great opportunity for leadership to see someone in action doing the work with the employee resource group as well as in their day-to-day job. And I also think stretch assignments are a great opportunity to get additional exposure to talent. I would say personally, I actually got the opportunity to be promoted out of a couple different stretch opportunities because it got me exposure to different people than normally see me. Next, let's talk about inclusion, the additional leg of the stool, and how can you really tell when a work environment is inclusive? It's one where employees feel welcomed, valued, respected, and heard. And this can come to be in many, many different ways, but I will give you some examples here of what it looks like. So when someone feels welcomed, they're invited to the conversation, to participate and share ideas, as well as given the opportunity and a safe space to be their authentic selves. Valued, an example of this is getting feedback. A lot of times underrepresented populations don't get the sort of feedback that they need from their managers to actually continue to grow and evolve in both their skill sets and their careers. And this is another area where we really need to make sure that we equip our leaders to have the right sort of conversations with talent overall, and of course with diverse talent. Respected. You know, this is really, I think, about seeing people as human beings and knowing who people are and really understanding the uniquenesses that they bring to bear individually. And heard, an example of that is seeking out ideas from people, listening to them, and actually implementing them. One thing that I definitely want to mention as we're talking about inclusion, that kind of can be an insidious thing if not really addressed, are microaggressions. There are these small behaviors that affect members of underrepresented groups and can really, chip away at someone feeling like they belong. It makes them doubt their own capabilities, makes them feel invalidated. And so we have to be really aware and have action planning for this. So I'll share an experience. At one of the places where I worked, one of the ERGs had identified a great stretch program called Mercado, which is Spanish for marketplace. And while the team member was sharing information about the program, they said Mercado with a Spanish accent because they were in fact Hispanic, which was, by the way, the correct way to say the word. And there were a couple people who started to snicker and actually, made fun of the pronunciation. And I interjected and basically said, first of all, it is the correct pronunciation. And second of all, it's very disrespectful. And so, my advice, on what you can do on the next slide really is the same thing, is you can call it out. Now, of course, how you call it out will vary depending upon your company culture and your relationship with the person. A lot of times aggressors are not even aware of the impact that they're having on people. And I really use it as an opportunity for, as a learning experience. And the way that I feel about it is, when you know better, you do better. And this is a place where we can help to share some of that behavioral knowledge with others, just to even increase their awareness and help drive different behaviors. Since inclusion can be an intangible concept for people, it's really important to make sure that we have metrics for it. And there are metrics you can use. An example is putting what's called an inclusion index into your engagement or pulse surveys. This is really a set of questions that talk about how employees feel around those elements of welcome, valued, respected, and heard. And what's great about the results is that you can then start to sift them and look at them by business unit or by leader, and you can start to see what are some best practices as well as some places where you need to do interventions. Again, lifting that piece of the manager's role, so much of an employee's experience has to do with their relationship and interaction with their manager. And when we think about DE&I, managers play a really critical role in ensuring that the efforts are understood, valued, and well executed. I think this is a place that is often missed because a lot of times things are coming from the top or coming grassroots and often miss the managers. So we really need to give them the right education tools and resources to help them execute well. They then become stewards of DE&I. And ultimately, as we all know, what gets measured gets done. And so we play a role in making sure that we are capturing the metrics. I think, a good place to start is that you get your baseline, you understand where you are, you put in place very tangible strategy that you deliver well against, you measure results, you reward for good behavior, and then you communicate about your results. So a couple of things that you can do as far as taking calls to action from what we've talked about: calling out inequities, microaggressions that you see, mentoring others from underrepresented groups, and really being proactive on making sure that others feel included. So we can't talk about the current DE&I environment without talking about COVID-19 and what have been the impacts of the pandemic on diverse populations. It really adds another level of complexity to this already complex work. As you can see here, these are some of the challenges that really everyone has faced during this pandemic: feeling isolated, mental health, concerns about job opportunities. However, there are particular groups that have been really hit hard and mostly very deeply affected by the pandemic. According to a McKinsey study on impacts of COVID, women, people of color, and LGBTQ have been the most hard hit. First, with people of color, they have the greatest concern about career progress and workplace and health and safety. And with the career progress, one of the things that could be playing into this is that when people have the opportunity to work with others that are different than them, it can help to decrease bias. But in this remote world, that opportunity has potentially decreased, and a lot of biases can still remain in place. It actually is to the point where, as an example, Black colleagues really feel like they are not valued and are much more likely to leave the workplace than their white counterparts. LGBTQ plus, really fear of losing ground at work and feeling isolated are primary concerns. Connectedness a lot of times comes from being able to participate with other LGBTQ plus colleagues as well as allies. And a lot of that has decreased during this, again, this virtual world, and the feeling of belonging has decreased as well. And next is women. So they're really citing mental health and additional household work, especially working mothers of young children. They are a lot more likely to actually be leaving the workforce due to these extra challenges. This slide really tells a story of how women are in this situation rapidly leaving the workforce and also have much higher levels of employment. And this is really important to understand, which is if this sort of trend continues, it really can reverse a lot of the great work that's been done. McKinsey has actually cited that the global GDP growth could be impacted by 1 trillion by 2030 if these sorts of things are not kept in check. So as we think about things that we can do, we can expand childcare assistance, to really help to accelerate and ease the entrance back, back into the working world. We can also create returnships, bringing experienced professionals back into the work world. And I think probably the biggest one that's being discussed right now is reassessing workplace norms. And a lot of this is introducing flexibility and considering things like hybrid work.
All right. Thank you, Heather. Some really, really good points there. Heather and I are just switching our screen shares right now. So give us 2 seconds to get that going. All right, now we want to talk about how do we drive inclusion in a post-pandemic world, which is really tricky. So we have all been subjected to the grand COVID work experiment. Pre-pandemic, 80 to 90% of office workers were in the office on a regular basis. Teams saw one another in person regularly. Managers could easily track what teams were doing by just popping in, and you could go to lunch or happy hour with your work friends. All of this contributes to employee experience. Employee experience drives bond, which impacts engagement, and that has an impact on company performance. It's one of the most important things that all leaders and managers in organizations today should be focused on. And we had all been working the pre-pandemic way for our entire careers. So now what? We all know what happened. All of those office workers went home one day. Most of them haven't gone back into the office, at least not fully. We started conducting business on our computer screens with a human staring into our homes. No more popping in or having lunch with our work friends. Now, we learned a lot from this experiment. And one thing that surprised us was productivity, for the most part, did not take a dip. We were all in crisis mode, and we pulled together to get our companies and ourselves to the other side of crisis. Productivity sustained. However, there were some costs, and I believe those costs are connection, collaboration, and career development. The result of those costs is now called the Great Resignation. It is difficult to create connection while most employees are remote. Employees don't feel bonded, and that creates an environment where they can easily pick up and leave. And by the way, there isn't anything to pick up. They just leave with no regrets. There are honeymooners now. So honeymooners are employees who've been with an organization for less than a year. Most of them have never met their teammates in person. They are not bonded. We then get into a vicious cycle of attrition and hiring that drives up cost, erodes profit and culture, and isn't sustainable. So now we're all in the enviable place of reimagining what the future of the workplace will look like. And we're all working to create something completely different and innovative. In order to do that, I think it's important to understand what companies need from employees and what employees need from companies. So let's dissect what companies need from employees. First, they need productivity. They need innovation to deliver for clients and to outpace the competition. And they need behavior that creates an environment where other productive and innovative employees want to be, and that's inclusion. So now, what do employees need and want? They need a paycheck. They want to make a difference and to feel like the work that they do has an impact. They want to be productive and they want to contribute. They want opportunities to learn and grow, and they want to work with people that they like, who support them, and who they connect with. And again, that's inclusion. So there is a lot of commonality in the needs of employees and employers. And what sits right in the center is the manager. Managers who understand that employees who are connected will bond with the organization and with their colleagues. Those employees will have higher engagement. And if they have higher engagement, they will perform better. The way that we are working now has thrown a wrench into how we traditionally bonded and created inclusion. Employee experience, engagement, and productivity have always hinged on people managers. And we're now at a new level of expectations with people managers. There's no longer separation of work and non-work. We've been talking for years about inclusion and bringing your whole self to work. And the pandemic has accelerated that in a virtual world. We don't have a choice but to bring our whole selves to work. Emotional well-being has been thrown to the forefront, and the manager is the connection to the employee and the organization in ways that just did not exist previously. We've all had to shift and meet individual employees where they are, and the ability to do that separates those who are successful and those who are not in a virtual and hybrid world. So let's go a little bit deeper on productivity, inclusion, and well-being pre and during the pandemic. Mid last year, while I was the head of HR at a different company, we wanted to try to understand what was happening with productivity during the pandemic and how managers were interacting with their teams. And we were able to see by using Microsoft tools how many one-on-one meetings managers were having with their employees and how many team meetings they were having. And what we saw was actually really interesting. We saw that for some areas in the organization, one-on-one and team meetings were not happening. And in other areas, they actually increased during the pandemic. We cross-referenced this data with our engagement survey data, and we saw where managers were not having regular meetings, engagement was way down. Where managers were having regular meetings, engagement held or was up. Having meetings with your team to drive connection and productivity, it's not a hard thing to do. It just takes intention, and it matters because engagement drives profit. So inclusion, pre-pandemic, inclusion was something that all organizations for sure were focused on. Heather talked about that. And we tried to have an impact with employee resource groups, with surveys, developmental programs. During the pandemic, two forces really shifted the conversation and the actions. The first was video. Inviting teams and strangers into homes where the whole family is, and really being faced with not just the employee, but the person, their people who has a family home, and their kids who might need to be online school, or no family and potentially a sense of isolation. And the second thing was social unrest, that we all became unable to look the other way. And that forced organizations to have conversations that most were too afraid and unequipped to have previously. And that brings us back to our people managers. More pressure on managers to wade into these really difficult conversations. One other thing I'll hit here is emotional well-being. This wasn't something that companies talked very much about 2 years ago. Most companies have an EAP that employees can access, but we're all now really engaging in this conversation. Multiple studies have shown that employees seeking care for anxiety and depression has increased 30% during the pandemic. And that's significant and not something which we can stick our heads in the sand on. If our teammates are struggling with emotional wellness, they cannot perform at their best. So now let's talk about what the future might look like. The pandemic has forced us to rethink the value of the office. And I'd like to go back to my 3 C's: connection, collaboration, and career development. Connection is physically interacting with our colleagues, helps us to bond and helps us to bond with our colleagues and with the organization's culture. There's always the meeting after the meeting, and information shared in person has layers of nuance that cannot be conveyed through a computer screen. When you're not in person, you're missing that. In the future, many of us will likely not be physically together with our teams full time. The amount of attention and help given to employees should not depend on where they're working. Managers have to make sure that no one falls through the cracks. It's really easy to work more closely with the people who are in front of you and that you're familiar with. But if your goal is to have employees with high engagement so that they can perform for our customers, managers have to create the right connections for bond and engagement in this hybrid world. And again, this is inclusion. Collaboration that leads to innovation. So we have all learned how to collaborate on video. For the most part, I believe that this collaboration is very task-oriented collaboration. And what we're missing is dynamic collaboration that leads to innovation. And that oftentimes comes from serendipitous moments or comments that trigger thoughts and works much better when we're physically together. It's a lot harder to collaborate when some team members are in an office and some are remote, either on the phone or video. Managers have to make a conscious effort to be inclusive when some team members are remote. And I learned this the hard way a few years ago. I led a global team with some people in the office where I was and some scattered around the globe. For those in the office, it was easy for us to banter and joke around while we were in our global meetings. But those on the phone had a really hard time hearing and keeping up with the banter. One of my remote team members pulled me aside after one of our meetings and told me he was feeling excluded because he couldn't hear the jokes or participate. And I was really glad he told me because I could set a different tone. It's not that we don't want to joke around, but we have to do it in a way that includes everyone in the meeting. Switching to career development, particularly for those early in career who need mentoring, sponsorship, modeling, and to develop social capital to get things done. The social capital point is a really interesting point to explore. There's data that shows that in a virtual world, it takes 3 to 5 times more interactions to develop social capital. And we need social capital as a way to help us navigate our organizations and to make connections that enable us to be more productive and to build trust. And trust is the foundation for any high-performing team. It's just a lot harder for underrepresented groups and virtual underrepresented groups to develop social capital. Managers need to think about how to connect the members of their team with others who can either mentor or provide guidance. When everyone's in an office, it's relatively easy to run into potential mentors or those who can give advice. When you're remote, interactions tend to be much more transactional. In a hybrid world, it's easy to see how those in an office will have more opportunities to find mentors. We have to level the playing field, and it's in all of our best interests for all of our colleagues to succeed. The employee experience has, I believe, forever changed. And the pandemic has shown that because employees can be productive remotely, they're going to have new wants, and companies will need to figure out how to meet those wants and ensure that they are balanced with the company's needs. What's top of mind for me when I think about it from an employee perspective, it's convenience, functionality, and well-being. We all know the future is going to be hybrid, and it is the most challenging model to get right. With all the decision-making that has to happen, we have to be focused on maintaining bond that drives engagement and productivity and equipping managers to manage a team that is hybrid in an inclusive way. So as leaders in the business world, one of our primary responsibilities is to get and keep the best people the market has to offer. So let's talk about convenience, functionality, and well-being. Part of what employees are now going to want is convenience. We've gotten used to no commutes and wearing sweatpants all day. Employers need to think about the workplace ecosystem in a multidimensional way. We have remote work. Maybe there are satellite offices for employees to access to cut down on commutes to be used for more focus or collaboration time. And then there's an urban location for larger meetings and collaboration. Functionality is really about the ability to choose when and where employees do their work based upon what they need to accomplish. For someone who's earlier in career and sharing space with roommates, they may want to be in an office almost 100% of the time. For someone who has dedicated workspace at home, they may want to be home to do heads down focus work and in the office for collaboration and connection. The office will, over time, be reconfigured to have more collaboration spaces and fewer workstations and be more hospitality focused. And by the way, again, this will be a driver of inclusion. And then well-being, finding balance and being able to disconnect from work has become more difficult to do and more important to do. Messaging from companies about disconnecting and taking care of yourself, really important. And we've seen a big increase in this. You may have seen in the news that some companies are starting to shut down for a week to force employees to disconnect, and others are actually paying their employees to take a week of vacation. And they're doing that because their people aren't disconnecting, and they know that we have to take breaks so we don't burn out. Taking breaks also drives productivity. So I mentioned a number of times that there's so much more pressure on managers. Another pressure point is going to be adding to the manager's plate to figure out for their teams, what's the right balance and when should the team be in the office and when should the team be remote, and how to balance all of that for each of the team members. For teams and companies that can get this right, they'll drive connection, collaboration, and career development. Performance will be accelerated and they will be able to attract and keep the best people that the market has to offer. It's also important to understand how certain colleagues are feeling about coming back into the office and concerns that arise around health and safety risks, and work to understand what employers can do to make them feel safer, especially for those populations who have been disproportionately impacted by COVID, such as Black and Latinx. So much of the past couple of years has been unprecedented and caused companies and people to push the reset button on what's important. We have a once in a lifetime opportunity ahead of us to create a corporate environment where all people feel bonded and included. And I'm going to end here where we began. Companies who have a diverse, inclusive, engaged workforce outperform companies who don't. DE&I is good for the bottom line, and it is up to all of us to take action every day to create the environment where all of our people can bring their best and do their best work. And the landscape has totally changed. If we're all intentional, we will be able to create an environment where all of our colleagues can thrive. So let's go do it. And with that, I will be happy to open it up for any questions, comments, or feedback anybody has.
Well, great. Thank you, Michelle and Heather. That was very informative. This is John Fanning again. We do have one question. It looks like it came through here just a second ago. I will read it to you. Can you tell us how companies are expecting to handle the president's announcement about mandatory vaccines and weekly testing for companies of 100 employees or more? Has this been discussed? Question.
It has been discussed, yeah. So I'll take that because I was just on, we're a member of the conference board, and the conference board has a group of chief people officers and CHROs who get together to talk about topical issues. And I just had my call yesterday, and obviously this was the only topic that we talked about. So it's really unclear right now what's going to happen. We're going to have to comply, and we will comply. But OSHA needs to give us some rules on exactly what that looks like. So some of my concerns are the testing, who's going to pay for testing, and how do we provide that to colleagues who decide not to get the vaccine. Personally, I don't think employers should have to pay for that, but we'll see where we land on that. Tracking is another issue. There are tracking systems out there. Actually, Sedgwick has a system that we sell to our clients to help track vaccination status and testing status. So that's what Sedgwick will use in order to track our colleagues. We use Workday as our system of record, and Workday will be able to also track vaccination status and testing status. The testing piece they don't have today, but I think they're quickly ramping that up. So this one's going to be tricky. We think that OSHA is going to come out with the rules in the next 30 to 60 days. So we have a little bit of time to figure some of this stuff out.
Great. Thank you. There's another question. It looks like, can you talk about what might be the impact if a company is requiring back in office, non-hybrid environment?
The impact. So I think a lot of companies are already doing that. So what you're saying, is this an inclusion question? Maybe. I don't know if it's an inclusion question. A lot of companies are already doing that. And what they're doing is some are requiring vaccination, some are not requiring vaccination. That creates its own inclusion issue. And most of the companies that I know about are giving their colleagues time to get vaccinated. But at some point, they're going to have to make a decision if there's a vaccine mandate. What ultimately happens? Are they going to move to termination, or are they going to let those colleagues continue to get tested? I mean, this is uncharted territory. Even if you look at healthcare organizations, they've always required certain vaccines. They've required the flu shot, and there wasn't a lot of controversy over that. But the COVID-19 vaccination, there's a lot of controversy over it. So the next few months is going to be interesting to watch this play out.
Great.
John, we do have questions in the chat that Joy is going to run through.
All right, that sounds fine. I was going to go to those as well, but Joya, I'll let you take it.
No, go ahead, John. You got it.
Okay. Michelle or Heather, here's one more, and I think it's kind of related to that. It's from Deanna, and she asked, how can companies successfully operate in a hybrid environment? Okay.
How can companies successfully operate in a hybrid environment?
That's the question that I see there. Yep.
Yeah. So look, I think the key is the manager and figuring out when to get employees together to collaborate and to do that dynamic collaboration, and when to allow them to work remote. We all know many people want to have the option to be remote. I happen to believe, not everyone shares this belief, that if everybody is remote all the time, that your culture takes an impact and you don't bond. And I believe we're seeing that happen right now with the Great Resignation. So we've got to figure out how to bring people together to make those connections and to collaborate and balance that with remote work. And I do think that there will ultimately end up with a formula. It's not going to be a formula that applies to every single team because every team does something different, but there will be the right formula. So I'm a honeymooner because I started during the pandemic, and I have met some people. Heather's a honeymooner. She started during the pandemic, and I have a new leadership team on my HR team, and we had never met each other until we got together a few weeks ago. And that was awesome. We needed to do that. We had such productive collaboration that led to a ton of innovation. We're going to keep doing it. Now, we don't need to do it every day. We don't need to do it every week, but we need to do it. So I think the key is going to be, what's that right balance, and where do you get people together, require them to be together, and where do you allow them to be remote?
Sure, and Deanna actually had when productivity is low, but I think you answered that question pretty well. I do think we actually had during our summer workshop, we had a dinner, and everybody was really excited to get together face to face. It just is, there's a difference. We have one more that has come through. It says, as companies embrace the bring your whole self to work philosophy, how do you advise managers who are apprehensive because this is a clear shift from prior expectations regarding leave it at the door and maintaining professional boundaries?
Heather, you want to take it?
Sure. Well, it's interesting with this sort of work. I would say that there are a variety of different ways to appeal to people. I'll say kind of the head, the heart, the hands, and different people respond in different sorts of ways to different sorts of stimulus or information. And so I think, first of all, having a really clear culture, and culture being, if you say it really simply, the way you think and act. And the way that you think and act is a critical strategic enabler of the business objectives and for the company. So it's not a nice thing to have. It's critical. And so being really clear about what the culture is, and then what are the expected behaviors. It goes into how you get things done is equally as important as what you do. And then you start to be able to kind of reinforce that in everything you're doing. You can see it in your performance management. You not only look at what was done, but how it was done. You have your recognition system, which starts to then recognize for those behaviors as well. And I think, that's part of the systemic view. There are then people who are going to respond to data. When you really look at, DE&I and the ability for people to participate, honestly, that is where the magic happens. And that's where a lot of these results that we're talking about happen. You've got to have the ability for people to be engaged and be able to participate and bring all their best skills and unique skills to work and to the office. I think another way is, appealing to people in a way that resonates with them. I know, for example, in this work sometimes it may not resonate with someone until they know someone who's been in a similar situation. So, for example, there was a leader that we had at a previous company who was, pretty, I would say, not as progressive in his beliefs. And he actually had a wife who was in the construction industry, and she was working her way up and was in the process of becoming a leader. And she had confided in him on what a struggle she had, feeling like she was being evaluated fairly and like she was being given similar opportunities. And for him, that is when it clicked. When he saw someone he cared about going through, a situation where she was not being treated fairly. So my answer is there are a lot of different pivots that you can leverage that I think need to go together to appeal to people and meet them wherever they are and bring them along a journey. And you can take some of those tactical actions that we talked about today and implement them.
Great, Heather. Thank you. And we've got another one from Maria with Fernandez with the push for diversity. How do we avoid management from moving to a quota-like view so that the diverse candidates are not viewed as gullified by, but we have to do something, end quote. So
I can take this one, Michelle, and feel free to add. I think how DE&I is approached, how it's communicated, how it's rolled out and how it's enacted, all have to be, in line with the behaviors we want to drive and the results that we want to drive. It is actually never should be about just hiring someone. When you're hiring someone to check the box, it actually sets everybody up for failure. It sets the person up who has gotten the job because they don't have the right skills. And it set up the person that's the hiring manager. And that now perhaps reinforces some beliefs that they had, that this is not the right thing to do and that they're being forced to do something. And so I think, the way I've described it before is it's really about increasing the funnel of qualified candidates. And it's ultimately about hiring the best qualified person. And so, bringing in and diversifying, as we talked about on the diverse slates as an example, it's going to be really important that the people that are on that slate are qualified. They really are competitors for that job, and that ultimately the right person gets hired. So certainly there could be that perception or the pushback. And I think, unintended things can happen if you're not really, really clear about what the intent is and what the benefit is and what the process is.
great, thanks, Heather. Yes, there's a lot. It's necessary for us to rethink things. Here's another very good comment and question from Sue Keen. This is a compliance and ethics group which regularly focuses on training. Often in live training sessions, great questions come up which provoke a discussion. But in remote sessions, there is some hesitancy for folks to type questions which survive the moment. Any suggestions to get learning and comfort in front of these employees?
I can, I'll answer that from a bit of an inclusion perspective. I think, definitely being very thoughtful about how you structure meetings, thinking about the diversity of attendees and not just from your traditional demographics, but also from an introvert and extrovert perspective. I think that really comes to play when we talk about virtual. And I think it's creating an environment, first ensuring that it really is a safe space, and everybody treats it as a safe space and what is said there is sacred, so that real conversations can be had. I think also sending information out in advance, being really clear about the agenda, where you would like people to participate, giving them anything to read in advance so they can thoughtfully think about it. And I think, creating deliberate spaces in meetings for roundtables. So I'll give you an example. I used to lead the executive meeting at my last company. And so it was the CEO and his directs. And, you would find that perhaps some people were dominating the conversation and others weren't participating at all. And so we actually, for important topics, we did what we called a round robin. So we would actually go to every single person, and they knew that it was going to be happening, and they could either raise, questions, hesitancies, objections, and that was a forum to create conversation, but it had to be deliberate to make sure that that sort of participation happened.
Great. Thank you. Another thing I noticed that on some of these questions, there is the option to ask anonymously. And so maybe that's something people should look into incorporating.
Yes.
Great. Well, that seems to be all the questions. And I think, I thank you both. Heather and Michelle, thank you for your participation. I'll hand it off to Vanessa and Joya to wrap up. Thanks, everyone.
Joya, before you wrap up, I just want to say real quickly, thank you again to Michelle and to Heather. We actually had more questions. I think there were like 10 to 15 more. So that means you had us engaged. Thank you very much. And I personally learned some new terms. Returnships, social capital, the Great Resignation. There were so many. Thank you for the frank discussion. Very enlightening. And now to you, Joya, to conclude.
Thanks, Vanessa. Yes, I hate we didn't get to all of the questions, everyone. I do apologize. But if you need to reach out to Michelle and Heather, you can just let us know and we can provide contact information for them. I'm sure they won't mind. Also, just thank you again, Michelle and Heather, for your practical advice today. The slides and the recording will be posted on the GHBER website sometime next week. Of course, we get it out there as soon as possible. Unfortunately, this webinar was not approved by the Texas Bar for CLE as it didn't cover a specific law or regulation. You may want to look into whether this webinar qualifies as a CPE credit if that's applicable to you. Everyone, please join us in November for our final presentation of 2021. The topic will focus on shell companies based on the DOJ's recent injection of beneficial ownership requirements through the National Defense Authorization Act. And the expert speaker on this topic will be Ryan Hubbs. He is the Global Anti-Corruption and Fraud Manager at Schlumberger. So look forward to those details that are coming soon. We really hope that we can host this year in person. So just keep your fingers crossed, your eyes, toes, everything crossed that we can see each other again in 2021. We will definitely keep you posted. Thanks again to Michelle and Heather for a great webinar today. And we hope to see you in person in November. Have a great day, everyone. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.